Today we're going to be talking about some of the biggest myths of the First Crusade, some of the biggest misconceptions about the First Crusade. We're going to be talking about some of the latest scholarship, how that affects how we look at the Crusade, and how the Crusade changed elite culture in France in particular. This is the 12th episode of Just Feudal Things, a conversational podcast about medieval history featuring subject matter experts and enthusiasts. If you'd like to follow along, the home for everything Memory Medieval is on Substack. The link to that is below. I have just opened up the paid subscriptions, although you can think of it more like becoming a patron of my project. Since I'm actually not going to put anything behind a paywall, I want to keep being able to churn out as much content as possible, even to increase the amount that I'm putting out. And I want as many people as possible to be able to enjoy the show, be able to learn about history. A big part of the goal of this is for as many people as possible to enjoy and to be able to learn about medieval history. And if you have the resources and generosity and want to financially assist me in doing that, then you have the option now on Substack. But if you don't have the resources or otherwise don't want to, whatever, it's totally fine. Everything will continue to be free. So you can enjoy everything as it is. But for those of you who are able to support me in that way, it is much appreciated. You can find a link to my X account down below, and you can also be looking forward to a collaboration that I have with a large history YouTuber. I'm helping him write some scripts. The first one coming up is going to be on the Italian Normans. So I wrote the script for that one. It'll be pretty fun. And I'm going to be releasing in the coming months a medieval-themed deck of playing cards that you will be able to also purchase should you choose and want to be able to play with some very cool medieval-themed playing cards with all custom artwork done by me. Today's guest is Dr. James Naus, Associate Professor and Chair of the History Department at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. Dr. Naus has written extensively on the crusading movement and its influence on the cultural and political history of Europe. He is the author of Constructing Kingship, the Capetian Monarchs of France in the Early Crusades, along with a host of other articles and book chapters. He continues his interest in the early crusading movement with his current project, which is a history of Bohemond of Antioch. You'll find the link to go purchase his book in the description. And with that said, on to myths, misconceptions, and modern scholarship of the First Crusade. Let's address maybe one of the biggest myths, one of the most frequent misconceptions, or maybe one of the most controversial motivations. Were the Crusaders cannibals? Was there cannibalism? What's up with that?
Yeah, so it's not a misconception. I'll say right off the bat, it probably happened, at least if we're going to judge it by the number of sources that record it. I can't recall exactly, but a majority of Western sources and at least one Arab chronicle mentions it. The instance that's most often mentioned occurs at a place called Mara al-Numan, and it occurs, I want to say, in July of 1098. So about a year before the Crusaders would reach Jerusalem. A lot of historians have written about this recently, probably most prominently Jay Rubenstein in his book Armies of Heaven. Tom Asperge has also commented on this fairly extensively. And I think that the general sense is that yes, it happened. Rubenstein says it was probably more frequent than is mentioned in the sources. I'm not sure other historians have necessarily accepted that, but it was a response to what were terrible conditions at the siege of Antioch and essentially starvation and deprivation. So yes, the cannibalism happened. I think where the rumor circulates is this wasn't sort of an intended demonic possession or anything like that. It was, I think you'd read it properly as the how bad the siege of Antioch was in starvation.
Yeah, that's been my read on it when I've read about it. If I recall, there's guys starving by the hundreds. The starvation and the lack of supplies was pretty prevalent. So, what's the alternative here?
Thousands. Yeah, so this is, I think, the story of the First Crusade that's often not told, because we often tend to focus on, I think, the major set piece military confrontations, whether that be, at the beginning Nicaea or Dorylaeum onto Antioch and Jerusalem and whatnot. And we tend to imagine that the danger of the Crusades, because the majority of the people who set out on crusade never return to Western Europe. Most of them end up perishing, but they don't perish from sort of what we want to imagine they do in these big set piece battles, like Ridley Scott would have us believe in Kingdom of Heaven or something like this, which portrays the Third Crusade, obviously. But most of them die of exposure and starvation. So if you think of the Siege of Antioch, for example, which is like the biggest sort of moment in the First Crusade in a lot of ways. If you think about the Siege of Antioch, sieges are not nearly as exciting, I think, militarily as sometimes we make them out to be. Sieges of starvation are essentially large waiting games where you're attempting to cut off somebody inside a city longer than they can handle it. But what it means for the Crusaders is they also have to find food during this period, right? And so the longer the Siege of Antioch goes on, it's not good for the people inside the walls of the city. But the truth is, it's not good for the Crusaders either. And we know as the siege drags on, they're having to go further and further and further and further afield to find food. So I think it's really a reflection of how bad the conditions were than it is any kind of like pre-planned demonic possession or something like that.
Yeah. And another, I think, indication of that is that in all of my reading of history outside of the Crusades, there's not any instances of cannibalism for the Western Europeans. So it's not like sort of a culture of cannibalism and then they're on crusade and they're eating people. It's like they're starving to death by the hundreds or whatever. And then they're eating people because they have nothing else to eat.
I think it's, look, it's clearly a sensational experience on the First Crusade. There's no question about it. And the fact that the sources all pick up on it and mention it, you would read it that way. But again, it's to me, it's more reflective of suffering and how extreme an expedition the First Crusade really was than it is, as you say, that there's this cult of cannibals running around the West who go off to the East. There's no evidence of anything like that.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, maybe what you view as some of the biggest logistical challenges, or maybe some of the things that are not commonly thought of. Because that's one of the things that now that I've read a lot more about it really strikes me is just the logistical insanity.
Yeah. I've been dealing with the First Crusade in one way or another since I started graduate school in 2004. So more than 2 decades now. And I continue to read about it, and I'm continually fascinated about it. I teach it a lot as well. And I think the thing that as I've gotten more into it over the course of my career, that I find the most remarkable is how just impressive a journey it was. I don't think we necessarily appreciate that. And it's something I sometimes find difficult to convey to students. Living in 2025, the idea of going several thousand miles away doesn't sort of shock us in the way that it perhaps should have. The idea of somebody saying like, I've been to Jerusalem is like, oh, okay. Did you get back yesterday or what? And it's, from where I'm sitting here in Michigan, it's probably, a 10-hour flight or something like that to Jerusalem. But the idea of setting off from the West, and spending years and years and years on an expedition, is something that I don't think we always fully appreciate. Just sort of the psychological impact that must have had. I mean, many of the Crusaders are sort of European elites. They're sort of grandees, many of them coming from northern France, northern Germany. You're asking sort of the upper 1% to put their lives on hold, not for a week or a month or whatever, but for really an indeterminate amount of time that will almost certainly be measured in years. And for many of them, they'll end up probably dying. And they knew this before they left. So I think just the psychology of appreciating that is something that's worth reflecting on. But I think then the actual conditions on the march are also significant. Now, they had some sense of this kind of stuff, right? Because the whole background of the First Crusade is a long tradition of Christian pilgrims making the pilgrimage from Western Europe to Jerusalem. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why so many people were motivated to go, because the pilgrimage, path to the east was being cut off by the Seljuks. That's one of the things that Urban II really highlights in his speeches. But I think that so they knew, and some of the First Crusaders had been there themselves, not many, but some of them. And they certainly would have talked to people, and they had pilgrimage guides and stuff like this. But it's one thing for a small group of people to travel. That's difficult enough in the Middle Ages. But for like, when you're talking about, 50, 60, 70,000 people trying to make their way, if you just think of the logistical challenge on a daily basis of feeding that many people, it's immense. When I teach this to students, I often talk about, think about when in the modern world we go to war today, and think about the lead up to something like that. When the U.S. invades another country, Afghanistan or something like that, there are often months and months of logistical lead up that go, building supply dumps, building runways, building places to house the troops. These guys had none of that. They had a loose sense of like, Byzantium may open up some markets on the way for you as you walk through the Balkans. Good luck with that. And good luck with that. And certainly once they cross into Asia Minor, into hostile territory, they're totally fending for themselves. So by the time they get to Antioch, things are really, really rough.
So that leads me into a couple other, maybe we could talk a little bit then about the motivations of the Crusaders, because I got a lot of questions. I sort of put this, I put this question up to the audience on X, on Twitter, and got some interesting comments about the variety of motivations. And so I'm sort of the opinion that it's a little bit complicated. You can't, there's a lot of guys coming from a lot of different places with a lot of different things going on. But how would you look at their motivations, or their, I guess that's the way to say it. How would you look at their motivations?
That's a really good question. And it's in some ways it's probably the question that historians ask about the First Crusade. I'm overstating that slightly, but it seems to be the question that every time sort of a group of scholars think they get their head around it, somebody comes in and says, well, hang on a minute, what about blank? And so let me talk a little, since this is an episode on misconceptions, let me talk about how people have looked at that, what some of the problems with that are, and then maybe how we look at it now, and how I look at it individually. So until somewhat recently, and when I talk about recently, I'm talking about a historiography now that goes back the better part of 900 years. So, until the mid 20th century, the typical way you would explain this, and everybody had their own sort of twist on this, but we can group them into sort of categories. A lot of people explained the First Crusade in some sort of materialist way, right? That is, the Crusaders were going for their own material reward. And there are variations of what that looked like. So some people said, for example, the listeners may be familiar with what's called the second son theory, which is there were all these sort of second sons floating around Europe who didn't stand to inherit what the older sibling was going to get, and they needed land for themselves. And so the Crusade kind of gave them this way out. There are, a lot of people who have looked at this through sort of a colonial mindset, especially Israeli scholars, but others as well, who have looked at this in sort of a colonial mindset and seen, the fact that the Crusaders settle afterwards, and the Latin states, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is formed as sort of an early proto-European colonial enterprise, and they see it in those sorts of ways. But all of those share in common this idea that the Crusaders were going to get something material, whether it was land, whether it was money, or whatever. The problem with that is that it doesn't hold a lot of water. It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of common sense, and you still see this floating around in textbooks. Actually, you still see this sort of stuff. I come across this all the time. It makes sort of sense to our sort of common understanding, but it doesn't really withstand much scrutiny. So, for example, it wasn't second sons that went at all. It was mostly first sons. In fact, when you look at the list of like the high-ranking nobles who go on crusades, it's not sort of an afterthought. It's actually among the highest-ranking nobles in France and Germany and Italy, particularly. The only people who are really excluded from that are crowned heads of state, at least on the First Crusade. Secondly, the idea that people were going to get rich, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. One, if that was the plan, they failed miserably, because in fact, and there are various attempts to estimate how much it cost, but it certainly cost an aristocrat or a noble just tremendous amounts of resources to be able to go. And that makes sense if you think about it. If you're First of all, most people's wealth was in land, which means lots of people had to sell off land in order to be able to go, which means they were giving up an asset that they couldn't easily get back to get liquid wealth to go off on crusade, which they were going to be spending to go on crusade. And the thing is, most of them, one, they either don't make it all the way to Jerusalem, or even if they do make it to Jerusalem, the truth is most people who are successful first crusaders come home. They don't take land. It's a small group that stays back. And then the other thing we forget there is that the first crusade is a really long expedition, right? Urban preaches it at Clermont famously in November of 1095. If we exclude for the moment the Crusade of 1101 and we look at the major sort of point for most people in the First Crusade, the capture of Jerusalem, that's July of 1099. It's a huge amount of time. So the motives during that period and a lot of the factors involved in decision making changed during that. And one of the primary ones we need to not forget when we talk about initial motivations is the fact that the idea was that Alexios was going to get back land that had belonged to Byzantium. And so the Crusaders would not have expected going into this to have set up a kingdom. And in fact, we know this because when they have to set up the Latin kingdom, they're kind of scrambling around like, oh, what do we do now? There's no coherent plan that goes into that. So those are to me, the primary misconceptions that go into the First Crusade. If you want to know about how historians have looked at it more recently, I would really point the viewers primarily to the work of a British historian by the name of Jonathan Riley Smith, who died just a couple of years ago. He's, really, I think, caused an entire generational shift in how Crusader motivations are studied. And he primarily studied Crusader motivations through the use of a type of source, which are called charters. Charters are essentially receipts. They're transactions of oftentimes land sales between, in this case, departing crusaders and the monasteries that recorded these transactions. And the charter is the individual document, and they're put together in what are called cartularies, these giant, essentially books of receipts that monasteries would keep. Jonathan Riley Smith went all over primarily France and studied these things. And what he saw in them, and he put them in a database, and it's kind of funny to read his book because the book in which he does this, I think, is published in the late 80s or early 90s. And he talks about using computer software, and he talks about, using I can't remember what the software is. It's like the first Oracle database and how this is going to revolutionize. And you now think about how we use computers. But he uses this, and what he finds is that overwhelmingly what people talk about is that I'm going off to Jerusalem, and they say some version of for the sake of my soul or for my salvation or some version of that. And so that really became, I think, the dominant thinking, certainly in the 90s and in the early 2000s while I was in graduate school. The idea that the primary function of the First Crusade, or the primary initial motive of why people joined this expedition, was for the salvation of their souls. And that makes all kinds of sense when we plug that into what's going on in the broader context of Western Europe at the time. The Crusade comes at sort of a fever point in what's known as the Reform movement, and sort of monastic reform began quite a bit earlier. But there was several hundred years leading up to the First Crusade of church reformers telling secular society that they couldn't be perfect, right? You can't be as perfect as a knight, or as a monk, excuse me. And in my view, this creates a sort of a real anxiety in Europe's nobles. It creates a huge anxiety to tell somebody who, on the one hand, is being pulled in the secular direction of being told to be a perfect knight, you have to train to fight, and you have to find ways to go out and fight and do all this kind of stuff. But then you're increasingly being told by monks, especially, yeah, if you do that, you basically can't be saved and you're going to hell. And it creates this real spiritual anxiety. And like often happens, I think, when we get an idea, the idea outpaces reality. And so one of the ways that I tend to frame the First Crusade for my students and in my own mind is to imagine it as this this kind of escape valve for these guys. And what Urban so brilliantly does in November of 1095 is to say to Europe's knights, look, there's a way in which you can do what you're trained to do and what society is demanding that you do, that is, be a good knight. There's a way to do that in a way that's spiritually acceptable. And in fact, it's spiritually admirable. And so the idea that armed pilgrimage becomes a thing, armed penitential pilgrimage, that's really Riley Smith's contribution, Riley Smith and others, but primarily Riley Smith's contribution. And I think that really shapes the way that we tend to think about motivations today, which is that at their initial core, people went for religious reasons. So that's kind of the meta view. I think in the last couple of years, we've started thinking that's a little bit difficult too. We're talking here about 70,000 people or whatever, however many tens of thousands of people it is. And it's really hard to talk about a motivation. That's a football stadium worth of people. And not everybody goes to the football stadium for the same reason. And not everybody stays through the game for the same reason. And so I think one of the things why this is such a difficult thing to answer is that motivations almost undoubtedly varied from person to person. And motivations certainly changed over the course of the First Crusade, right? If you set out in the summer of 1096 and you made it all the way to Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, think of what you've experienced in that, right? You've had the Byzantine emperor essentially welch on his promise. You've endured immense suffering at Antioch. You've experienced what you can only interpret as sort of miraculous successes. So your worldview looks a lot different in July of that year. So I think that's the other kind of dynamic piece of the puzzle, which is that motivations clearly changed during the expedition.
That's a really interesting thought as well about the motivations changing during the expedition, because I think it's really, I think we have a tendency, and I'm obviously not blaming anybody. I think this is natural to just want a simple explanation, like they went to conquer or they went for religious reasons or whatever. But just, obviously the scale and then thinking about your motivation changing over the course of that time is another, sort of complication, I guess, that, we have to think about these people. We have to think about these largely men, as people, and that, they're human and they experience this insane event. And so thinking about it in that direction really, I think is a good way to think about it.
Well, can I interject there? And
please.
Let me just tell a story about somebody I'm thinking about a lot and writing about at the moment, which is one of the more famous First Crusaders, who people will probably have heard of, Bohemond, typically known as Bohemond of Antioch. So for those who don't know him, Bohemond, he's a fascinating character. Bohemond is a son, sort of he is a son of Robert Guiscard, of the Hauteville clan in southern Italy. But Robert abandons Bohemond's mother fairly early in his life and goes on to a better marriage, which is another story, which is pretty interesting. So Bohemond kind of grows up, somewhat landless, a wandering guy with an unsure inheritance. And the traditional narrative, and you see this in nearly every textbook that talks about the First Crusade, even ones, by the way, that have embraced the idea of pious motivations, still tend to see Bohemond as an outlier and say, well, not everyone's pious because look at this guy. So he sort of famously takes the cross a bit later. He's already had some interactions with the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I in the 1080s when he and his father attempted to attack the Balkans, sort of modern day Albania. It was a failed attempt. And so a lot of people have said, and Bohemond ultimately in the First Crusade goes on after Antioch is captured, and he plays a direct role in capturing Antioch. He goes on to basically install himself as the first ruler of the Christian sort of principality of Antioch, and basically pieces out of the rest of the crusade and says, I'm done. I'm not going to Jerusalem. He only goes to Jerusalem sort of later after the fact, probably being threatened by an archbishop, by the Archbishop of Jerusalem, by the patriarch, that you're going to be excommunicated if you don't actually fulfill your vow. So a lot of people have taken this guy and said, look, if you want proof of materialist motivations, this guy has it. He attempted to steal land from the Byzantines in the 1080s. When that failed, he recognized the First Crusade was all about going back and setting up land. Yeah, there's probably some truth there. But like all of these things, it's never that simple, is it? So In fact, Bohemond had much more land in Italy than we traditionally give him credit for. But the argument I would make is that he's a great example of how crusade motivations change. So Bohemond was, above all else, to me, sort of the quintessential opportunist. He was, and this is true of Normans in southern Italy generally. They were really, really good at recognizing, yesterday it made sense for me to do this, but today I can benefit by doing this. And so I'm going to totally flip-flop and change my world outlook because it benefits me. This is, to me, what happens to Bohemond on the crusade. There's no way that he could have foreseen the idea that Alexios was going to abandon the crusaders and that he would have the chance to get Antioch. That's an impossibility for me to accept. What I can accept, though, is that this guy sets out with one set of motivations on the crusade. And I think there's some complexity there, and revenge may play some role. But when he realizes they're at Antioch and Alexios isn't coming, he's totally able to say, hey, you know what? It sounded good to continue on to Jerusalem, but I sense an opportunity here, and I'm gonna stay at Antioch. So my point is, you have that kind of complexity times whatever 70 or 75,000 people.
Boy, that's a great point about Norman, especially Italian Norman opportunism that I hadn't thought of before. Even though I post about the Italian Normans all the time. I read about them all the time. But they were prime opportunists. They had this sixth sense for opportunity, and they could just, when they saw something. And that's one of the things that to that point, one of the things sort of logistically that I struggle to comprehend in that narrative where you're saying that, it makes sense that Bohemond went for one reason and sort of changed his mind, is the idea like, oh, well, he convinced everybody that he should get Antioch or whatever. But there's no way like you mentioned, there's no way for him to know that Alexios is not going to show up. But in the event that Alexios were to show up, I think the Crusaders, by and large, probably would not have allowed him. He wouldn't have had essentially any backing by anybody to actually stay in Antioch. Whereas since Alexios didn't show up, then he sort of has most people's backing with the exception of Raymond.
So I would actually think this is probably one of those points, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I think this is one of those points where by the time we can be somewhat definitive on, I think it was highly unlikely that Alexios was ever going to show up at Antioch. And I'm not trying to be hypercritical of the Byzantine emperor here, because I think we have to always be very careful that we have the benefit when we get to pick up a narrative of the First Crusade, and there are many good ones out there, of being able to take like that meta view and see, okay, this is going on and this is going on. And we get the view of like, we're God and we get to see everything at once. We have to, though, if we're assessing motivations and people's decision making, we have to be fair and put ourselves in their perspective and make the decision with the vantage point that they had. And so the vantage point and I'm not saying Alexios was a great guy here. I am saying, though, that as events play out at Antioch, Alexios is in Constantinople. And even if at some point he had thought about joining the crusade, and I don't know whether he did or he didn't, but he had gotten a steady stream of crusaders who essentially were deserting the crusade. And many of these were high-ranking crusaders who were deserting the crusade, who were traveling back to the West, who were telling him essentially, it's over. Like, Antioch's fallen. The Crusaders are doomed. By the time I'm arriving here to you, they're probably already all dead. And so I think, to be fair, there's a world in which both Alexios is making the smart decision as the Byzantine emperor to say, okay, well, it doesn't make sense for me to now put myself in harm by going to Antioch if it's already over. But also, if you're the Crusaders, here's a guy who promised repeatedly to come and he's not coming. So I think both of those things can be kind of true at once. And we have to be cautious when we start assessing motivations to make sure we're only blaming somebody for the things that we can actually blame them for. Does that make sense?
Let's talk about that a little bit then, because I hadn't thought about him sort of getting this steady stream of deserters. It's sort of famously just Stephen of Blois and Hugh of Vermandois. Is that right?
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about,
because they're Hugh of Vermandois is the brother of the French king. Stephen of Blois is not only a prominent noble in his own right, but also married to Adela of Blois, who is the famously the daughter of William the Conqueror. So you have these two super high profile cases, but we're told in a myriad of sources, there's a pretty steady stream of deserters going back. Just people who aren't named necessarily. And we get some glimpses of this. I haven't read some of those sources in a while, but I think the guest Francorum names a couple of them at some point. It at least gives first names or something. I could be mixing that up with another one, but there's a pretty steady stream of people going back to the West.
How should we look at guys like Hugh of Vermandois and Stephen of Blois? I think typically, Stephen mostly takes a lot of the blame, or is sort of gets a lot of the negative publicity from that. How should we look at them?
The so-called the cowards or the deserters. This is an interesting question. There's been some research in the past couple of years, and the name of the historian who's written this is escaping me. It may come to me in a moment. Looking at sort of cowardice, and I think it's an interesting question. So again, I think it's, we want to be fair to people, I guess, right? I mean, it's easy to look back and say, oh man, look, these guys go on to have this miraculous event at Jerusalem and you ran away. Oh man, you're a coward. You're worthless. And certainly that was the pressure that those guys felt in Europe, because we know the so-called third wave of the First Crusade, or some people call it the Crusade of 1101. Many of those guys will go back on to finish their vow because they feel such shame of having gone home. I guess my own thinking on this is I tend to be a little bit empathetic with their position. So again, I think like to go back to where we started this conversation, when we talk about cannibalism, you can certainly read that in a sensational way. And I'm not justifying cannibalism. I just want to be clear to your viewers. But I think that the most compelling thing there is how reflective that is of how bad it was, how bad the conditions were. And so I think you sort of have to read the desertion in the same way. These people almost certainly believed that this was their only option to live. I don't think they were deserting lightly. I think they were deserting because they were put in really harsh conditions. And they certainly would never have anticipated that. And I think it's fair to think that they must have thought that Jerusalem was not probably what was on their mind, right? Like when Stephen departs, I don't imagine he was thinking, boy, these guys are going to go on to Jerusalem without me. I think he was imagining, if I don't leave now, we're all going to die. That would be the psychology you would have. And so I think we have to be careful not to read what happens after the fact, right, back on the decision making on the day that they leave. I'm not justifying cowardice or anything like this. And yes, certainly there's an aspect of cowardice to that. And I think they pay a significant price. This is actually the part of the First Crusade that I've written on the most, which is looking at, and this kind of touches on a number of the topics that you're talking about, but looking at really what the First Crusade does give to people. I don't think it gives them a lot of material reward for the most part. But I think what it gives them is a massive amount of prestige. And the phrase that I coined in my first book was it creates what I called a new economy of status. And I don't think that Hugh and Stephen clearly pay the price for not having that currency, which is what drives them back on the Crusade of 1101, or at least it's a primary force driving them back. But I think they would have had no way of knowing that in 1098 when they departed from Antioch. And I think in fact, I think the whole reason the First Crusade creates this new sort of culture of prestige is precisely because nobody would have thought that it was possible. I mean, the whole reason the Crusade was so impressive afterwards, and this is a whole area we can talk about if you want, but the whole reason that it becomes one of those moments, an inflection point, and it generates more sort of secular literature than just about any other event in the Middle Ages, is because it really shouldn't have worked. I mean, the Crusaders should have been wiped out. And so the only way that the medieval West was able to understand it was in totally divine terms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about your book and that theory, and a little bit about what you wrote about, because you had mentioned it briefly, and I thought it was really interesting, that concept of status and how it affected the ruling elite at the time.
Sure. So I was really interested in two things when I started the research for this project, which was first my dissertation and then my book. I was interested in the early Crusades, particularly the Crusades in general, but especially the early Crusades. And I was really interested in sort of France and particularly the Capetians, the French kings. I was looking for a way to sort of study those with the early Crusades, but they don't really participate on the First Crusade. In fact, the French king at the time, Philip I, is actually an excommunicate, so he would have been barred from participating. He surely could have resolved that if he would have wanted to. And he almost certainly didn't want to, because I argue and will make the point here that I think Philip must have been super giddy when all of these people went off on the First Crusade, because he actually controlled very little territory. He was much weaker than many of the prominent nobles around him, many of whom go off on the First Crusade. And you have to imagine there was a dinner at some point where Philip was just giddy and celebrating that all his enemies were walking off to almost sure death. It happens again, by the way, on the Third Crusade for Philip Augustus. The problem is the First Crusade is an overwhelming success against those odds. And so the way people begin to rationalize that is, man, these guys really did something that was miraculous. So the best example I can give you here is the First Crusade chronicler Robert the Monk, who's a Benedictine monk, writing in the Champagne region of France, in the city of Reims. He writes the Historia Hierolysimantana, and in the preface to that, he says something, I'm going to get the quote wrong, but something very close to, I'm writing about this event, which is comparable only to two other events. The first of those is creation, and the second is the incarnation. The third is the First Crusade and the capture of Jerusalem. So just think for a moment of the rarefied air that the First Crusade sits in, right? It's comparable with creation and the incarnation. That imbues a status onto those people who participate in the First Crusade, which makes them like medieval rock stars. I don't even know if that does them justice. And we know this because, again, I'll use Bohemond as an example. I mean, Bohemond goes off and he's sort of a warlord from southern Italy. He's fairly well off, but he's certainly second tier by most calculations of the nobility. Bohemond goes on, of course, as I mentioned earlier, to become the Prince of Antioch. He doesn't stay there for very long, though. He gets imprisoned. Then he comes back to the West and he arranges for a marriage to the King of France's eldest daughter, Cecile. He marries Cecile quite famously in Chartres Cathedral. And he uses the occasion of his wedding to preach a new expedition, what ultimately becomes known by some as the Crusade of 1107. You can imagine anyone who's married how well this went over, right? He stands up like on the wedding day and says, "Oh, by the way, before we finish this wedding thing, let me tell you about the benefits of going on a new expedition with me in 1107," which many people call the Crusade of 1107. We're told by a Norman chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, that his name became so famous. But Bohemond, by the way, is a nickname. His real name is Marcus, but we're told that his name becomes so popular as he makes this sort of tour in France, like as he makes his way towards Paris, that it becomes like a popular name for parents to basically give their kids. And it reminds me when I read that passage of, like, you know, in the 1960s, like how many babies became named Ringo or something like that after the Beatles came to do a concert in New York or something. All of a sudden you get a lot of, like, you know, John, Paul, and Ringos floating around in maternity wards and stuff like that. And so, I mean, it gives you and people were coming out into the streets to see this guy. I mean, these were like staged parades. He was actually sending like memorabilia ahead of him so that when he would enter town, like people would, you know, grab a piece of his garment or whatever. this guy is not nearly famous enough before the Crusade to get that kind of attention in France, which I think says something about what kind of impact the First Crusade happens. It's also worth mentioning, by the way, that the woman he married was actually engaged to somebody else who was a very high-ranking noble in France. And basically the engagement's called off. And the abbot of Saint-Denis, Abbot Suger, writes in his history of Louis VI, his history of Louis the Fat, the Abbot Suger writes that Bohemond basically was a better match because of his crusading prestige. I mean, he says that not in those exact words, but he makes it pretty plain. And I would argue and do argue in my book, that this creates a real crisis of authority for the French kings, because they didn't go on the First Crusade, and their entire notion of kingship was based on sort of sacral kingship and the idea that they were God, selected by God. Their entire anointing ritual, which occurred with, the Holy Chrism, famously going back to Clovis, they were anointed with this Holy Chrism. The royal touch, they healed diseases of the skin by touch and stuff like that. That was demonstrating that they were God's selected kings. And yet they were missing from this event that created that compared to creation. And so what does that say about their sacral authority? And so I actually argue that what you start to see is people directly around those French kings, particularly at the Abbot of Saint-Denis, which was the official or unofficial sort of court biographers of French kings. They actually begin to create crusading identities for the French royal family, despite the fact that they didn't go on crusade until Louis VII goes on the Second Crusade. Louis VII is not a great crusader. I mean, the Second Crusade is, an unmitigated disaster, depending on how you look at it. And nonetheless, they generationally and systematically recast the French kings and the French royal house into great crusading dynasty because of how important it is to be associated.
Actually, so I'm going to go a little far afield here, and I'll let you. Then we'll bring it back in, but I'll let you because as you're talking about this, because I've read a lot about the First Crusade and I've read a lot about the Third Crusade.
Yep.
And it always kind of puzzles me how Philip Augustus so easily abandons the Third Crusade. And in my opinion, this is of course for anybody listening, this is my non-scholarly opinion. Uneducated, unscholarly opinion, is that ultimately, in my opinion, Philip is largely responsible for the failure, a quote unquote failure of the Third Crusade by undermining Richard, by abandoning the crusade early. But when you're talking about this crisis of authority and status, then is it possibly a motivation of Philip to maybe, because I hadn't thought about this before until you were just talking about this, that maybe it's a motivation for him to actually undermine the Third Crusade or make sure that it doesn't succeed, because then that creates a sort of, let's say, crisis of divine perception, if you will, between himself and Richard. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I mean, it's an interesting question. I see Philip a little differently, Philip Augustus, and I'll put my cards on the table. We haven't talked about this ahead of time, but I actually just happened to get done writing an article on why Philip went on the Third Crusade and left. So those sources are sort of fresh in my mind at the moment, and I'll give you my take, and I've probably become sympathetic to the French kings, so that may be a bias that I have. I don't think I'm particularly wed to Philip Augustus, but I tend to think that he's pretty unfairly treated, and I don't think that the ultimate outcome of the Third Crusade is necessarily Philip's fault. I mean, it's a counterfactual, right? We don't know if he stayed. Who knows what would have happened? But I don't think it's necessarily his fault. So I would go backwards a little and look at Philip's initial decision to go on the Third Crusade. I think it's a more remarkable decision than some people give him credit for. And there's a document particularly I would point people towards, which is he gives a last will. Again, the monk who records this is a guy by the name of Rigord, who's another one of these monks at the monastery of Saint-Denis. So Saint-Denis is essentially the official royal historiographers or the royal historians of the French royal court. And Rigord writes a history of the deeds of it's called the deeds of Philip. When he talks about Philip's decision to go on a crusade, Philip is actually confronting the fact that he probably will die, or there's a high possibility that he will die, and how he wants France to be divided up if that happens. And so just from a risk reward standpoint, like, reflect on that for the minute. This guy's going off and not, this is not sort of like some politician flying to a war zone, but they've sort of made it safe beforehand for a photo op. This is a guy who's actually going off and saying, like, there's a pretty good chance that the Capetian dynasty comes to an end with me, but I still need to go off and do this. So I think he was a genuinely committed crusader. I happen to think that kings are sort of a special category of crusaders that we don't always appreciate enough, because I think again, it's a term I've used in writing before, in print before. The risk and reward for kings is pretty high, right? I mean, these guys are going, just think, even if they don't get killed in battle, think about the idea that a king is like, I'm going to go off to the east for years on end, and I might not come back. Like think about that for a minute. How foolish a decision that is by any kind of like theory of politics, unless you believe that the crusade has become sort of this obligation that is part of kingship. Certainly we see this by the time we get to Louis IX. That's pretty widely recognized. I mean, Louis is clearly an obsessed crusader. I argue that is based in sort of this family heritage. In terms of the departure, I think it's unfair because kings have to balance against their crusading obligation. On the other hand, they have to balance it, in the case of Philip Augustus, against his obligation of king. And if you look, and I don't have images prepared here, but if you look at Philip's territory, and I'm sure you can Google a map and find this. If you look at the territory that Philip Augustus controls, like in the years right before he departs on the Third Crusade, it is minuscule. It is not the Philip Augustus of the end of his reign, where a good chunk of France is his. It's pretty minuscule, and certainly the counts of Flanders and Blois Champagne vastly outscore him in territorial holdings. In fact, so much so that he signs an agreement with a number of them that when they die, he's going to get some of their territory. The fact of the matter is, those people die in Syria. And in fact, there's a historian of Philip, a great historian, John Baldwin, who has a famous line in his book, which I and many others have stolen, which says something like, Philip leaves the major French nobles, or buries the major French nobility in the sands of Syria. What this means is the entire political chessboard back in France changed in a very short period of time as people started dying. So I would actually argue that Philip had an obligation as king to leave the crusade, because he had to make sure that the agreements were followed and that he didn't lose his territory in France. And I would just also, and I know I'm sounding like a cheerleader for Philip here. I mean, I also think that he, a lot of the sources we have for the Third Crusade are Anglo-Norman in origin, which are naturally going to favor Richard. And actually, I tend to think that Richard is a far oversold crusader. I think Richard was a fine military tactician. I see it. I think Richard was a great military tactician and a brilliant mind. But as a third crusader, the truth of the matter is that, like, he wasn't super diligent about it. I mean, right? Philip goes and is fighting at Acre and holding down the fort. Well, Richard is still back in Sicily, and then goes on in Cyprus and does all these other things. And so I'm not sure it's totally fair to say, when Philip fakes a stomach ache or something like that, and he may well have had malaria, who knows, when he fakes a stomach ache, I think there's a lot more complexity again to it, that if you're a king on crusade, there's a lot more complexity that goes to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable.
I don't mean to knock, although I understand. Yeah. Richard. I have a graduate student writing on sort of the image of Richard, and there is, when you sort of pierce any kind of sort of Richard mythology, I do understand there's a collective gas that goes on, and I don't doubt Richard was a brilliant military tactician.
I'm a
No,
big
this is a
Richard
question I
fan,
asked.
so it's
Like, was he
but this is
was he a successful crusader or not?
I'm sorry,
Was he a successful crusader in your mind?
Richard.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
having never gotten to Jerusalem himself.
Uh, well, so I mean, you can only like play the pieces that you have.
Yeah.
I don't think being a successful crusader is necessarily. I mean, the outcome is the goal is so outlandish that, in my opinion, it's so ridiculous, and he is so beset by so many difficulties, including like Conrad sitting in Tyre for the entire time.
Yeah.
Obviously Philip leaving, the financial situation, the division between the French contingents of his armies, even the Pisans and the Genoese fighting each other. He's sort of he's like the nominal head of the army, but at the same time, he has to sort of wrangle this whole coalition between the Templars and the Hospitallers and the French and the Genoese and the Pisans and Conrad and all these different guys. That it's not like he's leading necessarily an army of 20,000 of his own guys, where he can sort of make a decision and do a thing. So he's got a lot of issues, I think.
And look, Saladin is an impressive foe. There's no question. I don't mean to sort of like shade Richard. Although I have a piece coming out where I argue that Richard, I think a lot of Richard's motivations go back to his relationship with his own father. And I think if you look at the context and particularly the location of where Richard takes the cross, like, I think a lot of what Richard was trying to work out on Crusade, I don't know, maybe I've read too much Freud or something in my life, but like was his failed relationship with his father and whatnot, and showing himself as a better king than his father, I think is Richard as a crusader. So I mean, I guess my overall view is that like kings should be treated a bit separately. I think you're spot on though about like judging the success of a crusader, particularly a crusading king, I think has relatively little to do with how successful you are, because there aren't very many successful crusading kings, right? I mean, Louis IX is the best example here. He's not a very good crusader, if you judge that by military achievement. On the other hand, he is canonized in part because he's such a great crusader. So I think the way that you embrace your crusading responsibility has a lot to do with it, more than it does sort of military outcome. Certainly by the time we get to the later 12th century, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And sorry, I'm just I'm very biased towards Richard. So
I know,
but this is why I like talking to historians, because I need you to set me straight. I don't like saying anything nice about Philip. So we need a little context.
The last time I was in London with somebody, a fairly prominent historian in the UK, and I was not quite escorted out of the country, but the looks that I were given was sort of like attacking the George Washington cherry tree story, I think, or something. So I'll be cautious. I'll make sure to be not in the UK when this article comes out. But yeah, I would, for people who are interested in the Third Crusade, I think I'll make a plug for John Hausler's book on the Siege of Acre. Really fantastic. I think it's a fantastic view of balancing those kinds of things. I think he does a really, really good job with it.
I'm looking forward to getting into that one. I'm hoping to get into that one and then get him back on the podcast.
It's fantastic.
So let's bring it back to the First Crusade. There was a point that I wanted to revisit that you had mentioned, and you had talked about how there was this reform movement and the monks were telling the nobility that you can't be perfect. Essentially your function as a warrior is sort of condemning yourself in the afterlife.
I mean, I'm oversimplifying a pretty complicated process, but yeah, for sure.
And I just wanted to mention that it was interesting when you said that, because I started reading again the Gesta Tancredi by Ralph of Cayenne, and he mentions that in the very beginning of the intro, which I don't know. I mean, maybe you could talk about this a little bit, if this is like sort of because I think I'll come back to that in just one second. Let me say that I think there's for the layman, for somebody like me who's not trained in understanding historical sources, of course you can read it literally, and then of course there's the people will always say, oh well, that's just propagandistic, the source is biased. So in the Gesta Tancredi, Ralph of Cayenne is talking about how Tancred is this impressive knight. He's got all these skills, but he actually has this like crisis of conscience, because he doesn't want to be killing people.
Mhm.
So when the crusade is called, he sort of realizes that that's a way to sort of redeem himself, where he can like sort of both be in service of God and put his supreme skills to use at the same time.
Is summarizing exactly what's going on. You know, we when we think of the reform movement, we tend to think of the big inflection point in that as the investor contest, the struggle between Pope Gregory VII on the one hand and Emperor Henry IV on the others. That's only 20 years or so before the First Crusade is launched. We need to remember that Urban II, the Pope who calls the First Crusade, is very much one of those reform popes. In fact, during the early years of his pontificate, he's actually having to contend with, in some ways, a more powerful anti-pope, Clement, who's occupying Rome. And so for a lot of the early years of his pontificate, Urban's not even able to enter the city of Rome because the German emperor still has an anti-pope who occupies Rome. And in fact, we're told at one point when Urban tries to get into St. Peter's, like supporters of the anti-pope Clement are sitting in the rafters with like stones and throwing them at him. So in fact, Urban II spends a good chunk of the early part of his reform pontificate basically having to live with the Normans. And so he would have been exposed to Tancred and Bohemond and all the Hauteville running around southern Italy. And in fact, we know that Bohemond and Urban had a relationship which not a lot of people have been aware of well before the first Crusade. So when some historians have seen the First Crusade as a way for him to kind of assert his power, although not everybody has necessarily agreed with it. But I think it's important when we say crusade to be really specific about what it is that Urban's doing, what new he's doing at Clermont. And what he's really doing is taking a bunch of old things like pilgrimage, and he's repackaging them in a way that makes it really appealing to these knights who are worried about the salvation of his soul. Because, you know, the First Crusade begins for a lot of people when Alexios sends envoys to Pope Urban II and says, please send help. Urban realizes it's going to be really hard to spur a lot of Western knights to go fight on behalf of their Greek brothers. I mean, even though they're also Christians, by this point, you have the schism and people kind of think the Greeks are duplicitous in the West, and it was going to be really difficult to go. And so if you actually read the accounts we have of like Urban's speech or the people who wrote down their accounts of Urban's speech, he doesn't mention much about going to Constantinople. He doesn't mention much about going to help your Greek brothers. What he talks mostly about are pilgrims trying to get to Jerusalem. And so add this to the fact that ultimately what a crusade is just a special kind of pilgrimage, rather than a pilgrimage that you might take to Lourdes. You wouldn't have gone to Lourdes in the Middle Ages, but just an example that people might know. You might go to Lourdes today if you're a Catholic for various reasons. You might go to pilgrimage in a lot of other places. The best place to go on pilgrimage, right, because it's the city of Christ's passion, is Jerusalem. Urban was essentially saying to these knights, I need you to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He was just adding to that, because that's going to be so difficult, because, you know, there are all these Turks along the way who are going to try and kill you and you're going to have to fight back. Because it's going to be so difficult, I will give you an indulgence if you make it to Jerusalem. And so that's effectively all a crusade is. It's a special kind of pilgrimage. It's an armed penitential pilgrimage. That's right in line with what we see going on with the reform movement. Does that kind of make sense? It's sort of a complex thing. And it's really, in some ways, when I teach my crusading class, it's the hardest thing for, I think, students to grasp. But it's the most important thing is a crusade's not really a holy war in the sense that it's a war about going off to fight Islam or something like that. It's really not. The First Crusade is about sending armed knights to reopen the pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem. And the recognition is that you're going to have to fight people to do that. Hence you can be the knights. And it's going to be really difficult. So if you make it there, we'll give you an indulgence. And the genius of it, you're kind of going to have to go through Constantinople. So you're going to help Alexios in the process.
So really the genius of Urban was just in tying all of these things together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was the right man for the right time. You might add to that story, he was sort of a non-traditional background to become a pope, or at least for a medieval to become a pope. He was French. from northern France, and he had been reared in knightly culture. So it's reasonable for us to believe that this is a guy who, it wasn't by happenstance, right? This was a guy who understood what made knights tick, who understood what armed nobles were worried about. He understood what their anxieties were, and he understood the reform movement, and he was able to like package that in a way that had this like meteoric effect. Now, I think there is an open question of whether he realized the effect it would have, but he certainly knew intentionally what he was doing, I think.
Well, and that's something I think that comes up for Alexios, because I think the way that the crusade ended up, even just at the beginning with, these giant armies at the doorstep, is probably not exactly what he envisioned.
Almost certainly not. I mean, we don't have, at least to my knowledge, Alexios makes his pitch to Urban in the spring of 1095 at Piacenza, where Urban's holding a church council, and we're told that envoys arrive, and essentially that's where they make the pitch. And then Urban spends the next couple months sort of probably hitting up some of the major nobles, particularly in southern France, while he prepares for the Council of Clermont. Almost certainly what Alexios was asking for was armed knights from Europe to come and fight on his behalf. The problem for him is the first group that shows up is not that really at all. It's the so-called, it's been called a lot of different things. Jonathan Riley Smith would call it the first wave. Some people call it the People's Crusade, Peter the Hermit's Crusade, whatever you want to call it. The first group of people who end up there, although there are some knights among the group. I mean, they're not all sort of poor peasants. This is certainly not what Alexios was hoping for. He was not hoping for unarmed, non-wealthy, untrained people. And you see this because he quite quickly passes them off over to Asia Minor and tells them, why don't you go ahead and wait and stay away from my city, essentially.
Yeah, and I've come to, with speaking with a few people who are certainly much more experts on the Eastern Roman Byzantine history, it's made me appreciate Alexios's handling. It's quite a difficult situation for him. As it turns out, with all of these different factors and the giant armies and then the logistics, and, he's got wars on other fronts and lots of different, his internal political situation is obviously, I think, tenuous at all times, is probably standard for the period. So he seems like he doesn't do a perfect job. Nobody's perfect, but he does, I think, a pretty brilliant job generally of handling the whole situation.
Yeah. I think Alexios has been given an unfair sort of casting in many Western accounts, particularly ones from the early and mid 20th century. I think there's a lot of sort of Greek duplicity that goes along with that, and some of that comes that tends to be in general histories of the Crusade, and some of that comes perhaps from the fact that they're reading what becomes a pretty tense relationship between Greeks and Latins as the crusading movement goes on. The West is very suspect of, for instance, any of the Crusade settlements making truces and agreements with the Greek Empire, and then you throw in the whole Fourth Crusade debacle to that. And I think it's easy to read that backwards onto Alexios. So I certainly think we need to be more sympathetic to Alexios. I think that there are some Byzantine historians who have written about Alexios in the First Crusade, and they almost go, and this is oftentimes the case, right, when the pendulum swings, they almost become such apologists for Alexios that they perhaps uncritically follow Anna Comnena, his daughter, who writes about it. And Alexios is seen as maybe a little more, a little more effective than he actually is. And they particularly, I think, are too eager to explain away the fact that he never does support the Crusaders in the way he says he's going to and what his motivations are. But certainly Western sources or Western historians, I think, have tended to be too hard on the Greeks, in my estimation, at least.
So do you think it's fair at the time, because this is a debatable point, whether or not Alexios broke his oath to aid the Crusaders? This is sort of a point of contention, I feel like, all the time. And I think actually you can read it from both angles, in that, and you even added the context today of the, sort of the stream of desertions. I think it's probably reasonable that he would trust, especially big lords like Hugh of Vermandois and Stephen of Blois. I think it's reasonable for him to trust them, or think that their analysis is correct. But at the same time, I think it's also reasonable from the First Crusader's perspective to view his oath as being broken. What do you think about that?
So I think both things can partly be true at the same time. I mentioned earlier being empathetic to Alexios. I'm not that empathetic. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that Alexios was like just chomping at the bit to get through all his administrative responsibilities, which apparently were never ending, that prevented him from going to aid the Crusaders at Antioch. I don't think this guy was ever at the point where it's like, oh man, if I can just get this business cleaned up, I can't wait to get out in the field and fight with my Christian brothers. I think that's a misread and a way overly generous read. I think he was quite happy once he got the Crusaders to take the oaths to him, that he reasonably expected these guys to sort of give back the territory. And I think he would have expected the Crusaders to return Antioch to him. And I think he was quite happy to have them do that. And he was in no great rush to go into Asia Minor and march into battle with these guys. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that sustains that. And I think some Byzantine historians have gone too far in that. When I say be more empathetic to him, what I mean is, when you ask the question, did he break his vow? I think if you're asking from a totally legalistic sense, right? If you see a vow as like a legally binding thing, yeah, I guess he did, right? Because from the Crusaders' perspective, he told them he was going to come and he didn't come. I don't think Bohemond was wrong in the most technical sense that the guy broke his vow, because where is he? From Alexios's perspective, though, it's like an agreement he made that he no longer needed to fulfill, perhaps because there wasn't a reasonable way for him to fulfill it. Does that make sense? So I think you can see it from both perspectives, but I do think it's reasonable from the Crusaders' perspective to say, look, this guy didn't come. Why would I return Antioch to him?
Yeah, and I've sort of made the argument a few times, like if Alexios doesn't show up, because, so for example, I've gotten into some discussions where people have said, well, Bohemond abandoned the crusade, but somebody's got to stay in Antioch. You can't just leave an empty city behind you after you've spent all this time conquering the city. So somebody has to stay. I mean, if it's not Bohemond, it's going to be somebody else. So it might as well be Bohemond if he wants to do it. Like, what's sort of the reasonable perspective here?
Well, I mean, he did abandon the crusade in a certain sense. I mean, Baldwin does too, right? In Edessa. I think that goes to that older narrative of Bohemond, that he's the, like, if you want to look, and I said earlier I was sympathetic to the French kings. I'm writing a biography of Bohemond at the moment, so they say that you sort of like become an apologist for those you biographies. So it's possible that I've grown attached to this guy and I'm defending him, but I mean, I think he has become the foil to like all goodness on the crusade. Like every time somebody wants to talk about some good example of something, it's like, and then there's evil Bohemond. He abandoned the crusade. So yes, I mean, it's true that he decides to not go. Is there another way that he could have shored up Antioch without being there? Who knows? I mean, he could have garrisoned at go. He also, I mean, in support of being critical of Bohemond, once they take Jerusalem, he's not in any great hurry to run down there either. And as I say, he goes largely under the threat of excommunication. And when he goes, he does not take up residence at Jerusalem. He kind of goes, and it takes one of those, like, you imagine like the double-decker bus tours you take on one of those tours of like, I have 4 hours in Paris and I need to see everything. I mean, our impression is that this is very much what Bohemond does when he goes to Jerusalem. So you can certainly make a case on that end. Does he fulfill his crusading vow or not is the question. And again, in the most technical sense, no, I guess he eventually does because he eventually goes. But this becomes one of those questions, again, to go back to our conversation with Richard, there's the canonical view of the crusading vow, right? There's the Pope's view. But then there's the view of the people who are like on the ground and on the crusade. And from Bohemond's perspective, he clearly thought he was a crusader. He markets himself as a crusader. And everybody else accepted him as a crusader. I mean, you see none of the people in the West are saying like, man, I was totally going to name my kid after him, but then I found out that he didn't go to Jerusalem until after the fact. I mean, so was Bohemond a first crusader? I mean, he was according to everyone around him. But yeah, you can make a case that he didn't fulfill his vow until sort of after the fact. I mean, it reminds me of sort of when we deal with sort of the idea of martyrs on the First Crusade. Later on, really as early as the 1140s, you start to actually see the Pope talking specifically about like what happens to people who die on the First Crusade, that they're martyred. In the First Crusade, we don't see that in urban speech. He doesn't say, by the way, if you go on this expedition and you don't make it and you're killed in Asia Minor, don't worry, thumbs up for you, you're martyred. But what we get is a popular sentiment that yes, that is the case, and the people who died as crusaders experienced that. So I think on some case the question of this turns on: are you looking at a strict technical canonical definition, or are you looking at sort of the popular experience on the ground and what people thought? And people clearly thought Bohemond was a crusader.
I think that's probably a pretty reasonable gauge of what did people of his time think. I'm not saying that that's like the end all be all, but if everybody thinks of him as a crusader, it's probably a reasonable assumption, because obviously the stories would have came back, right? Like people knew that he stayed in Antioch and didn't make it to Jerusalem until Christmas or whatever's the case.
He actually he's actually imprisoned. Then he's actually imprisoned for a while, and he comes back through Italy and makes a sort of a victory tour through Italy and France on his way to Paris, as I say. I mean, Bohemond's story is widely known. The main source we have for the First Crusade is an eyewitness account by an anonymous author, and the account is called the Gesta Francorum, translates to the deeds of the Franks. It's almost certainly written by a follower in Bohemond's retinue. We're not really sure who that is, and there's been a lot of speculation, but it's almost certainly a follower in Bohemond's retinue. And we know this because of both where the text picks up, but also the focus. It focuses primarily on Bohemond. The Gesta Francorum goes on, though, when Bohemond stays in Antioch, whoever authored it goes on with the main group of crusaders to Jerusalem and seems like tonally slightly perturbed that Bohemond doesn't go. That text was in wide circulation in the first decade of the 12th century. We know that because it is the base text for a number of what some people would call first generation texts. The one I mentioned earlier, Robert the Monk. There are others, Baudry of Bourgogne, Guibert of Nogent, and others that use the Gesta Francorum and actually copy large chunks of it. So the story of Bohemond staying in Antioch was like well known and celebrated. Yeah, this was not a secret to anybody.
All right. So we're coming up on time. If anybody has any, they want to read further, investigate further, what would you recommend for them to check out to learn more about the First Crusade?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So for the First Crusade, I'll give you sort of a smattering of some old books and a smattering of some new ones that I think are out there. I mentioned at the beginning the historian Jonathan Riley Smith. His work now are several decades old, and there have been good books since there. But to me, his book, The First Crusade and the Idea of Crusading, is still a really a book of fundamental importance, not just for the First Crusade itself and talking about the motivations, but especially for the last chapter in it, where I think he talks about how the West kind of comes to make sense. I think the chapter title is like Theological Refinement. I think that chapter is really good. Also, his book called The First Crusaders. It's a prosopographical study of who these people were and why they went. And if you want to really get at motivations, I think that's a good place to. I think that's a great place to start. So Riley Smith is still very good on this. There's been some recent work. If you like sort of more fringe views of it, I think Jay Rubenstein's Armies of Heaven is a really beautifully written book. I think Jay Rubenstein's an excellent writer. I don't agree with every perspective in there, but I think it's largely a pretty good book. And I think he uncovers a lot of information and puts it in a narrative fashion that makes it pretty readable. If people really like digging into sort of the scholarly nitty gritty on the stuff, I'm trying to think of what recently I've really liked. I think Tom Smith's new book on the epistolary culture of the First Crusade. I mean, this is getting really into the weeds here, but his new book on the epistolary culture of the First Crusade and sort of the letters that have come from crusading is just really well done. And then Nick Morton's book on the title's escaping me, but on sort of the question of whether the First Crusade was really a holy war about Christian versus Islam or not. I think he does a really good job exploring that. Those are fantastic. Those are fantastic books. There are others I'm sure I'm forgetting, but I can tell you and you can put them in the description.
All right. Sounds fantastic. And so what else are you working on? You're writing a biography of Bohemond?
I am. So I Bohemond, because I wrote on the French kings, he kept becoming a footnote and I became fascinated with him. So I'm working on a biography of Bohemond. I have an article on actually Bohemond's motivation for joining the First Crusade, which I think is coming out in the journal Crusades in the next in the next edition. I guess it comes out in the fall, but it's probably published online over the course of the summer. So I'm working on that. I have, as I say, some works coming out on. I have a book. John Hausler actually and Stephen Bennett edited a book on the Third Crusade, which I have an article on Philip Augustus coming out on. Next year is the production, which we've all been looking forward to, of the 2-volume Cambridge History of the Crusades, which is, at least the brief was to make it sort of the definitive work on the subject. So I wrote a chapter for that on sort of royal culture and the Crusades broadly speaking. And then I have a totally non-Crusade project, which is sort of my summer project I've been thinking about for the better part of a decade now. I've become really interested in sort of a framework for thinking about miracles in the Middle Ages and how we think about miracles and the possibility of miracles. I'm particularly interested in healing ones. Has nothing to do with the Crusades, but I'm reading a lot about miracles at the moment and enjoying it. So it keeps me busy.
All right. Fantastic. Well, when you release some of that stuff, we'll have to have you on again to talk about some of that.
Absolutely.
And if you thought we may not have enough to talk about, but imagine the incredible misfortune. He's just doing it all to gain land and treasure. And, we spend 90 minutes talking on the First Crusade and we don't even mention one time the Duke of Normandy, Robert Curthose. Imagine his great fortune, to go on crusade and spend decades in prison. He can't even get a single mention.
My Norman loyalties lie with Southern Italy, so that's probably subconsciously by design. I don't know, but yeah, you're right.
And I'll let you have the last word here. If there's anything else you want to say on the First Crusade, or medieval history, anything you want to talk about or mention one last time.
No, I think the only thing this conversation has reminded me, because one of the questions I get asked pretty often is, do we really need another book on the First Crusade or some version of that? And it just reminds me, again, we talked about, is there going to be enough material for however long we've been going here, hour and a half? And, we haven't even scratched the surface. And I think it's one of those events that's just so fascinating to keep coming back with new sets of questions. And, I would just encourage people. It's also a great thing if you don't know the primary languages, particularly Latin. Not everyone, but nearly every source, every main narrative source of the First Crusade is available in English. And so you can really delve into this kind of stuff and ask your own questions. And I would just encourage people to do it, because I think it's just every time I come back to the narrative of it, I'm fascinated and I learn a new thing. So thanks for giving me the chance to think about it again.